Welcome to this deep dive
Okay.
into the Jeffersonian era.
All right.
We're going to be exploring those pivotal years from 1800 to 1816,
Okay.
a time that really set the stage for the America we know today.
Right.
We've got some great sources to help us unpack all of this,
Okay.
including excerpts and quizzes from an AMSCO history textbook.
Oh, cool.
Don't worry, this won't be a pop quiz.
Nah.
Instead, we're going to use these materials as a jumping-off point for a deeper discussion.
Sounds good.
You might be wondering, was the Jeffersonian era a period of progress or paradox?
Hmm.
Jefferson, the champion of small government, oversaw the Louisiana Purchase,
Right?
which dramatically expanded federal power.
Yeah.
He grappled with international conflicts while trying to maintain American neutrality. And throughout it all, the very fabric of American democracy was being tested and reshaped.
Yeah.
So let's dive in and see what we can uncover.
So to really understand this era, I think we need to grasp the political landscape.
Okay.
Think about that incredibly intense election of 1800.
It was a bitter fight between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans,
Right.
almost tearing the nation apart.
Wow.
Then in his first inaugural address, Jefferson utters that famous line,
Okay.
"We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists."
You would think that after a statement like that, everyone would just come together and sing Kumbaya.
Well, if only it were that simple.
Right.
Politics is rarely about simple solutions.
Yeah.
And despite his calls for unity, Jefferson's presidency was marked by conflict. I think it's this tension that gets to the heart of whether this era was defined more by progress or by paradox.
Okay, let's unpack this idea of paradox a bit further.
Okay.
One of the most striking examples is the Louisiana Purchase, right? Here's Jefferson advocating for limited government.
Yeah.
Yeah, he makes this massive land acquisition that doubles the size of the U.S.
Right.
That doesn't exactly scream small government, does it?
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's a move that challenges our understanding of Jefferson's political philosophy.
He was a strict constructionist, meaning he believed in adhering closely to the Constitution.
Right.
And the Constitution didn't explicitly give the president the power to purchase land from foreign powers.
So how did he justify it?
Well, Jefferson argued that the purchase was within the scope of the president's treaty-making powers,
Okay.
and more importantly, that it was in the best interest of the nation.
So he was sort of like,
He saw the vast territory,
Yeah.
especially the crucial port of New Orleans,
uh-huh.
as essential for the future of the United States, both economically and strategically.
So he was willing to bend his principles a bit for what he saw as a greater good.
You could say that.
Okay.
And the Louisiana Purchase had far-reaching consequences.
Like what?
It opened up vast lands for westward expansion,
Right.
fueled debates about the future of slavery,
Wow.
and intensified conflicts with Native American tribes.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible to overstate the impact it had on shaping the political, economic, and social landscape of the nation.
Speaking of shaping the future, before the ink was even dry, on the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson commissions the Lewis and Clark expedition.
Right.
It's like he couldn't wait to see what this new territory held.
What's fascinating here is that the expedition was launched even before the Louisiana Purchase was finalized.
Really?
It speaks to the sense of urgency and opportunity that defined this era.
Yeah.
Remember, this vast territory was largely unknown to Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Jefferson envisioned an agrarian nation, a nation of farmers,
Okay.
and he needed to know if this new land could support that vision.
Right.
Lewis and Clark were tasked with mapping the territory, gathering scientific data,
Yeah.
establishing relationships with the Native American tribes,
Okay.
and importantly, finding a water route to the Pacific.
So they were really pioneers, venturing into uncharted territory and documenting everything they found.
Exactly.
Wow.
Their journals and maps provided invaluable information about the geography, the natural resources, and the people of the West. Their expedition played a key role in shaping American perceptions of the West,
Right.
fueling westward expansion,
Right.
and ultimately contributing to the concept of manifest destiny.
Yeah.
It's a direct link to that core question of progress, isn't it? Expanding westward was seen as a symbol of progress and national ambition,
Yeah.
but also came at a cost, particularly for Native Americans.
While all of this exploring and expanding was happening back in Washington, D.C.,
Okay.
there were equally significant developments in the realm of law and government.
Right.
This is where John Marshall enters the picture.
Oh, yeah?
He was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court.
Mm.
And he had a profound impact on shaping the balance of power in the young nation.
Right.
His most famous case, Marbury v. Madison, might sound a bit dry,
Yeah.
but it's anything but.
It's a landmark case because it establishes the principle of judicial review, something we often take for granted today.
Right.
But it was revolutionary at the time.
So what is judicial review?
Judicial review gives the Supreme Court the power to declare laws passed by Congress or actions taken by the executive branch unconstitutional.
Oh, wow.
It's a powerful check on the other branches of government.
So the Supreme Court could basically say, nope, Congress, you can't do that.
Exactly.
Wow.
And the fascinating thing is that the Constitution doesn't explicitly grant this power to the court.
Really?
Marshall, in his brilliant legal reasoning, inferred this power from the structure and principles of the Constitution itself.
So he was reading between the lines.
He argued that since the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and the court is tasked with interpreting the law, it logically follows that the court must have the power to determine whether laws conflict with the Constitution.
That's a pretty big leap, isn't it? Did everyone just accept that?
Not at all. This was a highly controversial decision. And it set the stage for ongoing debates about the role of the judiciary and the balance of power between the federal government and the states.
Yeah, I can see how that would be controversial.
It also had the effect of strengthening the power of the federal government.
Right.
Something that Jefferson, a proponent of states' rights, was likely not thrilled about.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Again, we see that interplay of progress and paradox.
It's amazing how these seemingly technical legal issues had such far-reaching consequences.
Yeah.
But the Jeffersonian era wasn't all about westward expansion and legal precedents.
Right.
There was plenty of drama and intrigue, too.
Oh, yeah.
And no figure embodies that more than Aaron Burr.
Oh, Aaron Burr.
He was Jefferson's vice president during his first term.
Right.
But their relationship was fraught with tension. Burr was ambitious and enigmatic, and he was involved in some shady dealings, including conspiracies.
Right.
And that infamous duel with Alexander Hamilton.
Oh, yes, that duel.
Speaking of duels, that one was legendary.
It was.
I mean, it ended with Hamilton's death and Burr's political downfall.
What's fascinating about Burr is that he represents the darker side of this era. He embodies the ambition and the ruthlessness that could sometimes accompany the pursuit of power.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that the Jeffersonian era, despite its ideals of Republican virtue, was also a time of intense political rivalries, personal vendettas, and shifting alliances.
It definitely adds another layer to our understanding of this era, going beyond the textbook narrative of progress and expansion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's in these more nuanced stories that we can truly grasp the complexities and contradictions of the Jeffersonian era.
And it looks like we're about to encounter even more complexities as we turn our attention to the turbulent waters of international relations.
Indeed. The Napoleonic Wars were raging in Europe, and both Britain and France were trying to pressure the United States to take sides.
Wow.
This put Jefferson in a difficult position.
Yeah.
He was committed to American neutrality, but maintaining that neutrality proved to be anything but easy.
So how did he respond?
Well, he tried a bold move,
Okay.
but one that backfired spectacularly. In 1807, he enacted the Embargo Act,
Okay.
which prohibited American ships from trading with any foreign ports.
Really, a total embargo.
He believed that this would force Britain and France to respect American neutrality.
By doing what?
By cutting off their access to American goods and markets.
It seems like a good idea in theory.
It does.
But I'm guessing it didn't quite work out that way.
You're right.
Yeah.
The embargo was a disaster.
Oh.
Instead of pressuring Britain and France, it devastated the American economy.
Wow.
New England, which relied heavily on trade, was hit especially hard.
Right.
The embargo fueled resentment towards Jefferson and his party and gave rise to widespread smuggling and evasion of the law.
So it had the opposite effect of what he intended.
And all of this further fueled tensions between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, right?
Because the Federalists mostly in New England.
The Federalists, concentrated in New England, saw the embargo as an attack on their interests.
Yeah.
And a blatant overreach of federal power.
So even as the nation was facing this external threat with these Napoleonic Wars, there were these deep internal divisions.
The embargo exacerbated existing political divisions and ultimately contributed to the decline of Jefferson's popularity and the rise of Federalist opposition.
So the Embargo Act was eventually repealed, but the damage was done.
Yes, and unfortunately it wasn't long before those simmering tensions with Britain boiled over into outright war.
And that, I believe, is where we'll pick up in part 2 of our deep dive into the Jeffersonian era.
Okay.
Buckle up, because things are about to get really interesting.
The War of 1812.
Well,
it's often referred to as the Second War of Independence.
Right.
And it really tested the young nation's resolve. You have to remember, the U.S. was still in its infancy,
Yeah.
facing off against the mighty British Empire.
It almost feels like David versus Goliath.
It does, doesn't it?
What were the main factors that pushed the U.S. into war?
Well,
I know the Embargo Act didn't exactly smooth things over with Britain.
you're right. The failed embargo definitely set the stage. But there were other major grievances fueling the fire.
Okay, like what?
The British were impressing American sailors,
What does that mean?
essentially kidnapping them and forcing them to serve in the British Navy.
That's outrageous.
Imagine being a sailor just trying to make a living,
Yeah.
and suddenly you're forced into service for a foreign power.
Right.
It was a direct violation of American sovereignty and a huge insult to national pride.
Were there any other contributing factors?
Yes, on the western frontier, there were ongoing conflicts with Native American tribes,
Okay.
some of whom were receiving support from the British.
So the British were kind of stirring the pot.
American expansion westward was seen as a threat by many Native American nations, and they
Uh-huh.
resisted it fiercely. The British saw this as an opportunity to undermine American power and influence in the region.
So it was a complex mix of economic interests, national pride, and geopolitical maneuvering that ultimately led to war.
Exactly. And it's important to note that not everyone in the U.S. supported the war.
Oh, really?
The Federalists, particularly in New England, were vehemently opposed to it.
Why is that?
They saw it as an unnecessary conflict that would harm their economic interests and strengthen the Democratic Republicans, their political rivals.
So even as the nation was facing an external threat, there were deep internal divisions.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
The War of 1812 exposed the fragility of American unity and the ongoing tensions between federal power and states' rights.
It seems like those tensions were a recurring theme throughout this era.
They really were.
Okay, let's talk about the war itself.
Mm.
How did things play out?
Well, it was a bit of a mixed bag for the U.S.
In what way?
Early on, American forces struggled particularly on land.
Okay.
They suffered defeats and setbacks, and the British even managed to capture and burn Washington, D.C. in 1814.
Oh, wow, I didn't realize that.
It was a huge blow to American morale.
Yeah, that must have been devastating both symbolically and strategically.
It was a low point for sure. But there were also some remarkable victories, particularly at sea.
Oh, okay, so it wasn't all bad news.
The U.S. Navy, though smaller than Britain's, proved to be surprisingly effective.
Really?
The Battle of Lake Erie, led by Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry, was a decisive victory that boosted American morale and secured control of the Great Lakes.
I can imagine the headlines back then. American David slays British Goliath on Lake Erie.
You got it.
And then there was the iconic Battle of New Orleans in 1815.
Ah, yes, New Orleans.
What makes this battle so fascinating?
Well, for one thing, it was fought after the Treaty of Ghent, which officially ended. The war had already been signed.
Wait, what? So the war was technically over, but they were still fighting?
Exactly. The news of the treaty hadn't reached America yet. General Andrew Jackson, leading a ragtag force of militia frontiersmen, free blacks, and even pirates,
Wow, quite a crew.
face off against a much larger and better equipped British force, and against all odds, they crushed them.
That's incredible. It must have been quite a sight to see.
The Battle of New Orleans became an instant legend, turning Jackson into a national hero and solidifying the perception of the War of 1812 as an American victory.
Even though it was fought after the war was technically over.
Even though the treaty itself was essentially a draw, it didn't really resolve any of the major issues that had caused the war.
So what was the lasting legacy of this rather messy war?
The War of 1812, despite its inconclusive ending, had a profound impact on the young nation.
Okay, in what ways?
It fostered a sense of national unity and pride. Americans had stood up to the most powerful empire in the world, and in their view, emerged victorious.
Okay, but like you said, the treaty itself was basically a draw.
True. But the war had shifted something in the American psyche.
I see.
It also had a significant impact on the American political landscape.
How so?
Well, what happened to the Federalists after the war? They were pretty vocal in their opposition to it, weren't they?
Yeah, we talked about that a bit. Remember the Hartford Conventions?
Right, the gathering of Federalist delegates in Connecticut who were pretty unhappy with the war and the Democratic Republican government,
They met to discuss their grievances.
which included the war trade restrictions and what they saw as the growing tyranny of the federal government. They even considered the possibility of secession.
Wow, secession. That's a pretty extreme step.
But the timing couldn't have been worse. News of the Hartford Convention reached Washington just as news of the victory at New Orleans and the signing of the Treaty of Ghent arrived.
Oh, that's got to be bad for PR. Celebrating a victory while some are talking about leaving the Union?
The Federalists were seen as unpatriotic, even treasonous. their party was effectively destroyed, leaving the Democratic Republicans as the dominant political force for the next 2 decades.
So the war had the unintended consequence of solidifying one-party rule.
In a sense, yes. It also contributed to the demise of the first-party system in American politics, paving the way for new political alignments and the emergence of new leaders like Andrew Jackson, who would go on to become president in 1828.
It's fascinating how an event like the War of 1812 can have such ripple effects throughout history, shaping not just the political landscape, but also national identity and even individual destinies.
It's a great example of how seemingly isolated events can have far-reaching and often unforeseen consequences.
And how those consequences can continue to shape the world we live in today.
Exactly.
As we've been talking, I keep thinking back to those AMSCO textbook quizzes you mentioned.
Oh, yeah.
They weren't just testing our memory of dates and names.
Right.
They were pushing us to think critically about the material, to analyze different perspectives, and to consider the larger significance of these events.
That's the key, isn't it? We can't just passively absorb historical facts.
Right.
We need to actively engage with them, question our assumptions, and consider the so what of it all. Why does the Jeffersonian era matter to us today? What can we learn from it?
For example, one quiz question asks about the emergence of political parties in the early United States. It points out that different historians have interpreted the significance of this development in various ways.
Right.
Some view it as a sign of a healthy democracy with competing viewpoints and checks and balances. Others see it as a source of division and gridlock.
It's a great example of how historical interpretation is always evolving.
Yeah.
There's rarely a single right answer when it comes to understanding the past.
Right.
It's about weighing different perspectives, considering the context, and drawing your own conclusions.
It's almost like a puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah.
We have all these pieces of evidence, these primary sources, these historical accounts,
Right.
and we're trying to assemble them into a coherent picture, knowing that the picture might look different depending on who's putting it together.
Exactly. And that's what makes history so fascinating. It's not just a static collection of facts. It's a dynamic process of inquiry and discovery.
So what stands out to you as we reflect on this deep dive into the Jeffersonian era? What are some of the key takeaways that our listener might want to ponder?
Well, one thing that strikes me is the enduring tension between ideals and realities in American history.
Right.
Jefferson, for all his eloquence about liberty and limited government, also made choices that expanded federal power, sometimes at the expense of individual rights.
Yeah.
He grappled with contradictions just as we do today.
The Louisiana Purchase is a perfect example of that.
Right.
It was a bold move that opened up incredible opportunities for the nation, but it also raised questions about executive power, the limits of the Constitution, and the treatment of Native Americans.
And then there's the War of 1812.
Right.
It was a divisive conflict fought over issues that are still relevant today.
Like what?
National security, economic interests, and America's role in the world. The war had unintended consequences, both positive and negative, that shaped the course of American history.
It seems like every major event we've discussed has this element of duality. This interplay of progress and paradox, of triumph and tragedy.
It's a reminder that history is complex and messy, rarely fitting neatly into our preconceived notions.
And that's why it's so important to approach history with a sense of humility.
Absolutely.
A willingness to question and a thirst for understanding.
Yes.
We may never fully grasp the intricacies of the past, but the journey of exploration is itself rewarding.
I agree.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we encourage you, our listener, to keep exploring the Jeffersonian era and other periods of history that pique your interest. Read biographies of the key figures. Delve into the primary sources. Visit historical sites, and engage in conversations with others who share your passion for the past.
Because ultimately, understanding history is about understanding ourselves.
That's a good point.
It's about connecting with the human stories, the struggles, the triumphs, and the enduring questions that have shaped our world.
And who knows, you might just uncover something that changes your perspective, not only on the past, but on the present and future as well.
You never know.
Until next time, keep those deep dives going.